Okay, so theme for my talk is all about decoding. So obviously reading is much more than just decoding letters into sound. But main theme of what I'm going to be talking about is how fundamental that part of it is. So the process of learning to turn the letters on the page into sounds and then ultimately meaning. So in the very early stages, the children will be decoding words on a letter-by-letter basis. So my 4-year-old would read that as b, e, e. And then my kid that's in sort of mid-reception now knows that the combination of two E's together makes the E sound. And so they gradually learn more complex grapheme phoning correspondences. The idea, the theoretical basis of phonics teaching is that every time you successfully decode a word in this way, to start with this painstaking process, but every time you do that, you're providing an opportunity to develop the orthographic representation, so you're strengthening the mappings between the phonology and the orthography. And after about 1 million repetitions of this painstakingly slow process, the idea is that you eventually enable fast access from print to meaning. So this is like, as I'm sure you're all very familiar with, the essential sort of theoretical basis of phonics teaching. In England, teachers are taught this through the simple view of reading. So, but basically the idea is that decoding, so the ultimate aim, what we're trying to do is fluent reading and reading for meaning, and decoding is one part of that. So, and this is described as a multiplicative model because basically you need both decoding and oral language, so listening comprehension skills, in order to become a successful comprehender of text. And neither of those parts is sufficient in itself. You need both of those parts, which is why it's described with a multiplication sign. So this is the simple view of reading. Our work is largely sort of talking about the complex view of decoding. So obviously it's nice to talk about it as a simple view because it helps conceptualize the different processes involved, and it means you can talk about whether a child is struggling with the decoding element or whether they're just struggling with the comprehension element. It is useful in practice to separate those two things. But what we've been doing is really sort of looking at how complicated even the bit that looks the most simple in this model, even the decoding, but how complicated that is, how many skills are involved in that, and also looking at how these two areas on the left, they're not independent. So actually being a good decoder is actually good for your oral language skills as well, and we've got some data showing that being good at reading actually benefits other sort of broader language skills as well. There are lots of skills that are developing at the same time and they're feeding into each other. Okay, so key questions, what I'm going to be talking about. So three parts to this, but part one is really on the early work on focusing on the role of phonological awareness in learning to read, and in particular looking at the role of phonological awareness in the phonics context. And so we've done some work comparing children learning to read under more or less intensive phonics methods and looking at the role of phonological awareness there. We've also done some work looking at so obviously phonological awareness is huge, there's so many aspects to it, trying to pinpoint what are the most crucial aspects of phonological awareness, what's most strongly linked to reading. So that's the first part. I'll then go on to the second part, which is comes from our longitudinal study and looking at sort of what changes once you can decode words. So it's not a simple one-way relationship. So decoding ability influences other developing language skills. So obviously you need language skills in order to learn to decode in the first place, but then being able to decode then has knock-on effects on other language skills. And then the third part of the talk is the longer term bit. So this is what we're doing right now. So this is work in progress. And we're really interested in how your ability to decode words, your ability to do what we usually think of as the sort of the more basic basic reading skills, how that actually influences other skills that seem higher level, such as vocabulary. So how does your reading ability and the amount you read influence your vocabulary learning, and then ultimately academic progress in the longer term into secondary school. Okay. So first of all, first part of the talk, all about phonological awareness. So this is a study that we published in 2016 where we were comparing 2 early reading programs in schools around Birmingham. And what we wanted to do was to compare the skills that were important for children's reading under different teaching methods. Because obviously the way that you're teaching children to read means that you're going to be drawing on slightly different skills depending on how you're teaching them. And so we compared what we're calling an intensive phonics program, so the letters and sounds program. So this is widely used in schools in England, and I know that schools up here do use letters and sounds to some extent as well. So letters and sounds is classic phonics program. It's very much focusing on encouraging children to decode every word when they possibly can, minimising the number of tricky words and trying to focus on the grapheme-phoneme correspondences. And we compared that to schools who were delivering what we're calling a less intensive programme, sort of more mixed programmes, the early reading research programme, which did teach phonics, but it taught the minimum number of phonics skills. So it only taught the regular grapheme-phoneme mappings, so the most regular mappings. So it's only one, you're only teaching one mapping for each grapheme. So it's only the most regular ones. So it teaches fewer mappings. And it combines that with regular practice in sight words, recognising words by sight. So highly frequent words, whether they're regular or irregular, they'll all be taught by sight. And in every literacy lesson, they're doing phonological awareness in the absence of print as well. So they're doing lots of practice on segmentation and blending in the absence of print, so oral segmentation and blending. So the 2 methods are sort of subtly different. They both count as phonics, so phonics is still covered in both. But one is more intensive. The phonics is really, really the main focus, and the other one is less intensive, and it's combined with regular practice on sight words and combined with more phonological awareness work. So what we found is that overall, good news for schools in lots of ways is that the programs are equally effective. So it's not, so from the school's perspective, it's not a big deal which of these programs they're using. The average child is doing fine on both of these programs. But what we did find is that it changed the way that they were being taught, changed the skills that were important for reading. So the children who were taught in the letters and sounds program, their reading outcomes are more strongly related to their phonological awareness. So we know that phonological awareness is really important for reading. You've got this relationship, regardless of whatever you do, you need phonological awareness to read. But if you're being taught under a really intensive phonics program, that relationship's even stronger. So children with good phonological awareness are better readers, whatever you do. If you also teach them intensive phonics, that's even stronger. So the children have got an even greater advantage for having good phonological awareness. If that makes sense. So easier way to think about this. So we looked at the relationship for the kids overall, and so got a stronger correlation for the letters and sounds school. But if you then look at children who are struggling with phonological awareness at the beginning of school, so what we did is we gave them 3 phonological awareness tasks, phoneme completion task, phoneme isolation task, and a phoneme deletion task. And the children that couldn't score on any of those tasks, that scored 0 at the beginning of school, we looked at those children separately. And I've got some numbers I can tell you on the next slide. But basically the children, it's about 20% of the sample overall, and we've got a sample of about 800. So there's sort of large, decent-sized groups of children. Those children were not responding so well to the more intensive phonics program, which is actually quite counterintuitive for a lot of teachers, I think, because the assumption is that if you teach children phonics, then their phonological awareness will develop kind of naturally, and that might work for some children, but actually our data would suggest that it's not something you can guarantee. You can't just guarantee that if you teach children phonics, they're not necessarily, if they've got poor phonological awareness at the beginning of school, they're not necessarily going to respond well to that. And so I don't know if you can see the graph here very clearly, but basically we've got a, so that for the average reader, so the good, so this is the top 80% of the sample, it doesn't actually make any difference which program they get, they do fine. This is their scores at the end of reception, the number of words they could read correctly, so regular words, that's sort of regular words, exception words, and non-words. Top 80% of the sample, no difference between the two programs. Doesn't matter whether they're receiving letters and sounds or the early reading research. But the ones with poor phonological awareness, so the ones that struggled at the beginning of school and were just not able to do these phoneme awareness tasks, they're actually performing more poorly on the intensive phonics program, which is actually different to what many teachers would expect, certainly different to what you would expect given the Rose Review back in 2006, and this is that Letters and Sounds is the program that was emerged from that Rose Review, and so it is quite counterintuitive, but the whole point is to try and help children who are struggling with reading, and phonics is a good leveller. But I think what these data suggest is that children who struggle with phonological awareness at the beginning of school, they need something more than that. They do need to have that phonological awareness supported directly. You can't just assume that they will catch that up just through being taught phonics. So, guess what our message is that phonological awareness is really important for learning to read, but it's especially important when you're learning synthetic phonics, because basically you're not going to get if you're scoring at floor on phonological awareness tasks, if you don't understand that the word cat breaks into cat, if you haven't got that concept, then it's going to be very difficult for you to learn the principles of phonics, and so the classroom teaching is just not going to be appropriate to you until you've got that basic concept. And it's also sort of ties in with other work that we've done. Basically, we've got other work looking at the importance of phonological skills when children are reading non-words that must be decoded versus frequent real words. And what we find is that their phonological awareness is much more important. It's much more predictive of their ability to read non-words that they have to decode than it is of their ability to read real words, which they can. There are other ways around it, and they could be using sort of other orthographic familiarity, for example, to read that, or semantic context, etc. So, message from this: the child isn't. Well, I guess this is a backwards way. I mean, you guys, the emerging literacy work, doing a much more proactive. Have a much more proactive approach to this. Our message is that if the child's not responding well to phonics, you should check their phonological awareness and check they've got those skills that they need. Whereas actually you're doing this proactively and checking that they've got those skills in the first place before you move them on to phonics teaching. So it ties in really nicely with the way. But what we had is the phonological awareness test that we had. So they started off. So there's standardised tests that started off with quite easy stuff like syllable completion. So they've got a picture of watch, and you say wa, and they've got to say ch. So it isn't, and what we had, so 20% of the sample just couldn't score on any of our tests at all, even though they did start with sort of easier items. But what we want to do next is, so that study I just presented was, so it's a quasi-experimental study. You've got schools delivering two sort of programs that differ in lots and lots of different ways, and so it's actually quite hard to pinpoint what was exactly the difference. So we're assuming, and this is sort of ties in with what we had, so 20% of the sample just couldn't score on any of our tests at all, even though they did start with sort of easier items. But that the problem is that the letters and sounds programme wasn't sufficiently helping their phonological awareness for those children who starting school with weaker phonological awareness. But we can't say for definite what was the difference between the programmes. So what we're proposing to do to follow up is to do a short training study. And this will be in teachers in England. When a child isn't responding well to phonics, they tend to give them extra practice on the grapheme phoneme correspondences. That seems to be the first place to go. So if they seem to be struggling, they do more rehearsal of the letter sounds. Whereas my feeling is that they would be better off doing more rehearsal of the phonological awareness aspects, because those are so fundamental to actually getting phonics in the first place. And so what we want to do is a sort of short training study where we're comparing groups of children with poor phonological awareness, but then waiting until the second term of reception, so the second term of Prior 1, at least to give them a chance to see if those skills actually do develop naturally. But if they don't develop a second term, they're giving a short training study where we're comparing children who get extra training on the decoding plus the phonological awareness versus children who get extra training on the decoding plus the GPCs. And so that will sort of give a more precise picture about whether it really is the phonological awareness that's missing from those programs. So the theory is that it's the phonological awareness that's missing, and this will just sort of really pinpoint it more clearly. The next thing I want to talk about in relation to phonological awareness is trying to figure out what aspects of phonological awareness are most critical for reading. So the theory is that phonological skills are underlying the development of decoding strategies, and there's lots of evidence on correlations between children's performance on phonological tasks and their reading performance. But the problem is that phonological tasks are quite messy, they're quite noisy. There's lots of different skills that they're tapping into all in one task, and so it's quite hard to work out what are the skills that are really important that children need. So classic tasks that might be used as asking children to say the first sound in ball. They might be asked to repeat back a non-word, or they might be asked to delete part of a word. And these tasks are all tapping into lots of different things. They're tapping into more than what I've got here, but these are the three key components that we wanted to look at. So the assumption is that they're related to reading because they're linguistic tasks. They're using words or pseudo words, non-words. They're not using musical notes. And so there's the assumption that the relationship with reading is to do with the fact that they're linguistic tasks. It's not to do with the fact that it's not like a working memory task, for example. It's not just a generic working memory task. Another aspect of these tasks is that they're all the stimuli are always, so the words are complicated. So you're asking children to take the first sound out of bat, and in order to do that they need to segment it themselves, whereas it would be a very different task if you said at what came first, and then they just have to remember the first sound. So you're requiring sort of detailed phonological representation of the word. And the classic versions usually require children to say things out loud. So this is sort of the output phonology. They're actually having to prepare their phonological response, and they're having to actually articulate that. And it's not completely clear what the role is of these three different components of the task. So we did, as part of our study, this was actually with children in the middle of year 2, and we wanted to see what aspects of phonological awareness is really driving this relationship with reading. So we compared tasks that were, children were isolating the first sound of a word, and it was done in a linguistic form, so they were doing it with phonemes. So we had sort of sequences of phonemes, so the child would hear g, k, p, and they'd have to say which one came first. And then you can do the same thing with musical notes, so you go b, 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 and then they have to say which of those musical notes came first. And we did these on a computer, so they were learning the associations between the they had aliens on the screen. I should have had a picture of the aliens, but they were learning this. It was like sort of learning the piano. So there were 3 aliens, they made different sounds, and you were saying which alien came first, basically. And you can set up tasks like that to compare the same kinds of tasks where you've got phonemes versus the same kinds of tasks where you've got musical notes, and then that will let you look at, is it really to do with the fact that it's linguistic? Is it to do with the phonemes? Is that what's important? And then we do the same things, that comparing tasks that used words where children had to actually segment it to get the answer versus phonemes that were already separated for them. So looking at whether it was the segmentation that was really important. And then finally we did tasks where they had to say it out loud versus tasks where they used the sort of the alien touchscreen thing to respond. And so this was really to try and work out which of these components were really critical for reading. And actually what we found was that although the musical tasks, children who were good at the musical tasks, they were better at reading, but over and above that, their ability to do the linguistic tasks was important over and above their ability to do the musical tasks. So it was suggesting that the fact that the tasks are linguistic is important. That's quite reassuring for theories of sort of phonological awareness and reading, because the assumption is that it's the linguistic part that matters. Also, that we found that children who were better at the tasks where the phonemes were already separated for them, they were better at reading, but the tasks where it was all in one word, where they had to actually do the segmenting, that was important over and above that. So segmenting skills was really, really critical over and above just sort of ordering sounds. And then finally we found that the verbal versions were predictive over and above the non-verbal versions of the tasks. And that final bit is the more surprising thing, because the theory, sort of the dominant theories of phonological awareness and reading, it's all about the representations themselves. It's all about what's the quality of your phonological representation. Whereas what we were showing is that actually it's not just the quality of your representation, it's how good you are at accessing that and then articulating it. So actually having to say it out loud is important, but it isn't obvious in the literature that part of it is really important. And so what we were trying to do is just give a bit of extra precision. So you've got these tasks, they correlate with reading, but why do they correlate with reading? What aspects of the tasks are most important? And it really sort of, in general, like that, all of this work on phonological awareness is focusing towards the importance of promoting phonological skills in preschool and early primary on top of learning about letter sounds. You can't just talk about letter sounds, you have to also promote phonological skills. And the second part, in terms of which phonological skills are most important, suggests that because it's the segmentation that really matters, children's ability to, so working with individual phonemes doesn't seem to be as closely related to reading as working with words where you have to split up, you have to do the segmentation yourself. So the best activities would involve phoneme segmentation and blending. And it's really important to do this out loud. So it's not just about how good's the child's representation, it's how good are they at accessing that and saying it out loud and articulating that. And so this ties in well with the Highland literacy activities, sort of phoneme blending and segmentation activities that are encouraging children to sound talk as much as possible. That kind of thing is obviously really, that fits with this really nicely. I'd like to I don't know if there's, at the end, it'd be good to have a discussion about this, because obviously these are, segmentation out loud is the aspect of phonological awareness tasks that comes out as most strongly related to reading in our year 2. So these are, that would actually be primary 3 children. So these are sort of children that are able to read at this point there. And so that seems to be the most closely related to reading in those children. I know that with your in the emerging literacy work, you're talking about sort of building blocks of phonological awareness, and then actually the segmentation comes later, and so there may well be other building blocks that you need. So you wouldn't just jump, just because segmentation is most closely related to reading, it doesn't necessarily mean that you would teach it in that way. So just because that's kind of, I guess it shows this is what you're aiming for. This is what they need to be able to do in order to be an effective reader. But then there's another question about how you get to that point and how you teach it. So second part, in terms of what changes once you can decode words. So this is where I want to bring in the longitudinal project that I've been working on. So actually the data I just showed you was taken from this same project, but it's this. We also had an additional sample in year 2 where we did those phonological awareness tasks with. But what we've been doing, so back in 2011, we started working with close to 800 kids in 16 primary schools around sort of the outskirts of Birmingham. And we've been following them up. They moved from infant schools to junior schools, which then caused a sort of slight tracking problem. So we had a drop in sample size there. And then they've now moved into secondary schools, and we also are now having to get parental consent from the parents because of so GDPR came in just when they were in year 6, and so at that point we needed to redo the consent process with all the parents, and we did manage to we have got 350 parents on board, which is great, and but it did cause a reduction in the sample size because previously the parents were the school was consenting, the parents were just opting out if they wanted to. But yeah, so anyway, we've still got 350 of them. And we're currently at this point we've done the autumn year 7, so that's year 7 is the first year of secondary school, and we're going to go back in June to work with them again, and then we've got funding to go back again in the autumn of the second year of secondary school. So it's so the next 2 parts of the talk, so the second and third part of the talk, are all about this longitudinal sample. What I'll do is to start with is talk about this stage, so up to primary 5, basically the sort of the earlier part of primary school, and what we're going to be looking at is what changes as children learn to decode. So there's this chicken and egg problem with phonological awareness. So children need good phonological awareness in order to learn to read, but also there's evidence to suggest that learning to read actually improves your phonological awareness. So it's a reciprocal relationship. And also, so what we wanted to look at was whether we could show this in our longitudinal samples. There is some evidence on this, but not very long-term evidence. And so we wanted to look at whether being good at reading does improve your phonological awareness, and also whether it improves other developing language skills. And so the theory is that as you learn to read, you're getting more precise phonological representation. So the fact that you've got this orthography that you can map onto the phonology is sort of tightening these representations, making them more secure and more precise and more fine-grained. So I was trying to think of examples of words where this is sort of quite salient. So so the word etc., I think I say it right. But so actually being a reader and having that orthographic representation, the written representation of the word etc., helps strengthen your phonological representation of that word, and so you're able to judge that word is etc. rather than something a bit more fuzzy like etc. If you can hear the difference, it's not. And there's also, I had a chimney and chimley. So I was brought up actually saying chimley because I was talking to my mum about this at the weekend, and she claims that she knows that chimney is spelt chimney, but it's pronounced chimley. So it's sort of, it's possible that that's a kind of a dialect issue. She comes from southeast coast of England, sort of Sheppey, and she claims that everyone in Sheppey says chimley. And so she was arguing that her phonological representation of that word isn't any worse. It's just a pronunciation issue. So it's important to distinguish between that. But basically, another good word I find is ibuprofen. So as it's a really hard word to say, and actually being a reader gives you the precision, and you'll say ibuprofen, whereas maybe people who are less confident in reading might sort of fudge the middle bit and it's something like that. And so there's a difference between the pronunciation issue and the and what's in your head. But the idea is that what's in your head gets stronger and more precise as you learn to read. So that's the theory. What we wanted to look at is whether reading might also directly aid memory for learning new words, because better readers can actually use a visual cue for remembering those words. So I feel introspectively, I feel like I'm doing this when I've got a difficult word to remember. I visualise it, and that gives you an extra cue for remembering that word. And so you've got an indirect benefit of reading because you've got more precise phonological representations, but you've also got a direct sort of memory cue because you can actually visualise it. And so we wanted to look at whether we could observe these sorts of effects across the first 5 years of children's schooling. Yeah, you visualise the writing somehow. Yeah, what it looks like. You've got a picture of the letters in your head. So this is a paper that we've got under review at the moment. So we've done the analysis, but it's work in progress in the sense of the publication of this. But basically so over the first 5 years of school, we took these measures for the children, and we've got measures of their reading accuracy and efficiency at each time point. So at time 1, we used their letter sound knowledge because they were all non-readers at that point. But from time 2 onwards, we've got their word reading accuracy and efficiency for non-words, regular words, exception words. So that's our reading measures. At each time point, we've also measured their phoneme awareness using sort of the classic tasks of isolation and deletion of phonemes. So that enables us to look at. So we know phonological awareness will predict reading, but does reading also then have knock-on effects on your developing phonological awareness? We've also measured serial order memory. So using those tasks that I described before. Getting children to repeat back individual phonemes. So you'll say to them g, k, p, and then ask them to repeat those phonemes back. So this is different from phonological awareness. It doesn't involve any segmentation, but it involves short-term memory. And what we're interested in whether those kinds of tasks actually also predict early reading, because there is an emphasis, particularly if you're learning phonics, you're actually having to keep sounds in your mind, sort of like 2 or 3 sounds in your mind even when you're sounding out some quite simple words. There's a memory component to that. And then finally, we've got non-word repetition. So this is looking at whether reading actually improves your ability to repeat non-words, so remember new words. So children are asked to say a word like dopulate. So they hear dopulate on the headphones and they have to repeat back dopulate. And so we're interested in whether reading indirectly improves non-word repetition because it's improving their phonological awareness, and that has knock-on effects on their precision of their phonological representations, and that helps them repeat the word. And also whether it helps directly, so whether it has a direct effect. And the theory is this is because they're able to actually visualise the visual form of the word, and that gives them an extra cue to memory. All you need to think about is that on the top row, you've got reading developing. In the middle, you've got phoneme awareness developing. And at the bottom, you've got serial order memory developing. So this is children repeating back g, k, p, or we also did it with numbers as well, so 5, 3, 4. And so what we've added, so we know there's lots of literature on phoneme awareness predicting reading. And we found, so children with good phoneme awareness at age 4 were better readers at age 5. Children with good phoneme awareness at age 5 were better readers at age 6. And so it's having an influence for the first few years of school. But on top of that, what we are finding is that children's ability to work with these individual sounds, so the serial order memory, is actually having an effect at this early stage as well, but only at the early stage. So it's like when they were just grasping the phonics strategy, it was actually also really important that they were able to hold in mind 3 individual phonemes. So imagine they've just confronted the word cat, they've sounded it out, cat. They have to then remember that cat and then splurge it out in the right order. And so that's a memory component over and above their phoneme awareness. So that was our first finding that was novel. And the second finding that was novel is this effect. So I separated out, so that model is all about what predicts reading. And then this model is all about what reading predicts. So what are the benefits of reading? And so what we found here is that how good you are at reading at age 5 predicts how good you are at phoneme awareness at age 6. So your developing phoneme awareness skills are influenced by your developing reading skills. So being a better reader is good for your phoneme awareness. So it's sort of showing that it goes both ways. That's one thing we've shown there. Another thing we've shown is that being good at phoneme awareness has knock-on effects on your ability to repeat back non-words. So children who are good at phoneme awareness are better at repeating back doppelate. And that's true age 5 to 6, that effect happens, and then from age 6 to 9, you've also got that effect coming in at the later stage. But on top of that, there's this direct link here as well. So as well as, it's not just that being good at reading isn't only improving your phonological awareness and your phonological representations, it's also giving you an extra strategy for remembering new words. It's giving you, it's helping directly by helping you to remember the orthographic form of the word, and that's giving you another cue to memory. And so it's really good. I mean, reading is doing a lot in terms of your developing language skills, and it's really beneficial. So just to summarise this, so sort of 2 points from this. First of all, the relationship between phonological skills and reading changes over time. So there's different things happening at different stages of development. Phonological awareness is a really key driver. So we support what's already known in the literature. We know about the importance of phonological awareness. It's especially important for the first 2 years of school. We've also found that on top of that, this ability to hold sounds in mind, individual sounds in mind, sort of serial order memory, is important, as well as phonological awareness. And then I think the exciting stuff is what reading does for you. So learning to read improves your ability to repeat non-words, and it does that indirectly by helping your phonological awareness, but it helps you directly because you've got this ability to imagine a written form of the word. And this only kicks in once you're quite good at reading. So this direct effect only happens from age 6 to age 9. So once you're a good reader, once you've got to that point in reading, reading is actually then benefiting you directly. So for earlier stages of reading, you're not really, this memory for the visual form of the word isn't kicking in, but it does kick in later. Implications of this. So why is this important? So it's good to know that learning to read has knock-on effects on non-word repetition, because it means that if you intervene to improve reading, then that should also have knock-on effects on non-word repetition. Just to say, I don't know whether that seems obvious to everyone in the room why this is important. For a lot of people outside the field, you'd say, well, why do I care if a child can repeat doppelate? It's not a very useful thing. But actually, all words are non-words to start with, so it's actually a really good measure of how easily a child's going to be able to pick up a new word. So if you've got a more precise phonological representation and you've got better strategies for remembering new words, and that will mean that when you're confronted, like in secondary school or maybe even late primary, you're learning the difference between reflection and refraction. Having those precise phonological representations and having these strategies for remembering those words, for visualising those words, is going to help you hang meaning onto those words. So although it sounds really arbitrary, like repeating back non-words, actually it's really fundamental, because it's exactly what we need children to be able to do in a classroom context, to be able to tell the difference between similar sounding words. And that's even stronger when, so the next part of the talk is even longer term, and looking at this stage, so children from age 6 through to, we haven't collected the data, got 2 more time points to go, but we will be looking through to year 8. So this is the secondary 1 and 2. And so what's really striking here is the fact that, just to give you a heads up, basically that reading, skills that we would have thought of are quite basic, the basic reading skills that most teachers think, okay, that should be done by the end of primary. It's not done, it's still developing. And not only is it still developing, it's really important for vocabulary. And so you can, it's sort of giving ways in. So vocabulary, anyway, I'll use my slides rather than, but anyway, that's just a heads up. So basically, the motivation for doing this follow-up, this longer-term follow-up into secondary, came from the teachers that we were working with. So in England, so teachers are basically saying to us, look, what we care about is vocabulary, and they were concerned that their SATs, that they're the national assessments that they're doing at the end of primary, they were concerned that there was children who were performing poorly in those assessments, but they were really struggling to actually teach. So they felt that they were performing poorly because of lack of vocabulary, and they were struggling to actually teach that vocabulary, because unless you know what words are going to come up on the test, you can't sort of you can't teach every word in the English language just in case it comes up on the test, and it's actually very difficult to teach vocabulary because it's so massive, and so this was their real concern, and so we were interested in how reading can provide a way into vocabulary learning. Obviously you need the vocabulary at the beginning of school in order to learn to read in the first place, so obviously you still need to directly teach vocabulary, and it's really crucial to support vocabulary in the early stages. But what can reading do for you in terms of building vocabulary once you're actually an independent reader? And so there's data out there showing children who are better at reading tend to have bigger vocabularies, but we don't know why. So we've put forward sort of 2 options. So one is that children who are better at reading read more, they're more motivated to read, and then their own independent reading, it's exposing them to more words, a more diverse range of words than less able readers are being exposed to. So that's one option, it's just the amount that they're reading. And then the other option is that they're actually being good at reading, sort of being good at the basic reading skills, being an efficient decoder, helps you to use text better to learn new words. And so one way of thinking about this is that you're freeing up resources. So if you're efficient at decoding, you're not having to focus on that aspect of it, you've got some space left to actually process the meaning of the text, and so they might actually be picking up more meaning, even if they're not necessarily reading more often. They're better at using text. And so these are our questions that we're addressing at the moment, so this is ongoing work. So question 1, does being better at reading lead you to read more books? We're focusing on books in particular because of the evidence that book reading is best for building vocabulary as opposed to reading other sources. But we're also measuring everything that they read, but we're focusing in on the book reading as predicting that will be the key to vocabulary. So does being better at reading lead you to read more books? And then does the amount of book reading you do help to expand your vocabulary? So that's this kind of indirect link between reading and vocabulary, because you're just simply reading more. And they're also looking at whether there's a direct benefit of being better at reading, so you're somehow picking up the words from text more easily. So that's the model we're testing. At the moment, the main findings that we've got, first of all, for our sample, we've got this sample of children. They were in 16 primary schools around Birmingham. They're now in 50 secondary schools, inconveniently. So half of them are in, so there's about 25 schools that's got the majority of the sample, and then we've got this long tail of sort of children scattered around. But anyway, so in this sample of children, they're slightly lower SES than the national average, so the areas are more deprived than the national average. But yet they're doing really, really well on their reading. So they're all being taught synthetic phonics, and actually their average standard score is 110. It's basically, when you look at the distribution, it's basically shifted up the distribution, and this is compared to a standardised test back in 2012. So children now are outperforming their peers back in 2012, even though they're from relatively low SES areas. However, vocabulary is not looking so good. So they're slightly lower than expected for vocabulary, possibly because of the SES group that we've got. So their average vocabulary score is 93. So they're just a bit below average, sort of in the low average range. And also, interestingly, vocabulary is associated with home background. So we've got now that we're having to get parental consent from parents, so that's more challenging in terms of sample size, but actually it means that we've got direct contact with parents, and it means that we've actually got a lot more information to go on. So we've got, all the parents have given us a home literacy questionnaire, which included information on their own educational background, and parents' educational background is significantly related to their children's vocabulary, but it's not significantly related to their word reading, which is nice. So reading seems to be relatively SES free, whereas vocabulary is very much bound up in the SES of the children. Anyway, so that's findings so far. We have got a preliminary model, and we're going to have to keep. So because we haven't got all the data yet, I don't want to set too much emphasis on this. But one thing we can be sure of is that the vocabulary they come to school with is a very strong predictor of the vocabulary they got in secondary, which is quite scary. It's a very, very long time period, but it's very strong. It's about the strongest relationship we see in our project. So, but good news is that reading is doing something over and above that. So even when you factor in that really strong relationship between early and late vocabulary, their reading ability is independently predicting their vocabulary. So we're finding that better readers are reading more, and reading more is associated with having a higher vocabulary. So children who read more have higher vocabularies. And also, there's a direct influence. So being a better reader is associated with having a higher vocabulary. And that's all over and above what they started school with. So this is effects of reading. So it's like kind of the effect of what the teachers have added, basically, which is nice. Important things relating to this is that, as I mentioned before, they're still significantly growing. So between this primary to secondary transition, their general vocabulary, the British Picture Vocabulary Scale, that's still increasing, as you'd expect. But also their efficiency in reading sight words, so frequent words, and their efficiency with which they decode non-words is still increasing. So, and this is surprising. Many of the teachers we worked with didn't expect this. They expected that to have plateaued, because those kind of basic reading skills that's primary. They should have got there by then. They should be efficient readers, but actually it is still developing. And so what we'll be able to see is when that starts plateauing. So when that starts sort of tailing off, and they've got to sort of the ceiling of that. But at the moment, there's still room for improvement. So it would suggest that supporting basic reading skills is still relevant at secondary level. And also, even though these children were phonics, they're the phonics samples. So they basically, 2011, they started school. They were the first kids to get the phonics screener in England. So they are the sample that should have been taught to read in an optimal way, in theory. But yet, still got 13% of them who are reading below 9.5 years old in secondary. So we've got an advisory group of practitioners and someone from the National Literacy Trust and various people who I've been putting the functional reading age at 9.5, but they think that it should be higher because in order to access a typical secondary text, you actually need a reading age of higher than this. So we've kind of underestimated how many children are likely to be struggling, but we know that at the very least, you've got 13% of the sample who are not really going to be able to access secondary level texts because of their basic reading skills. It's not because of their comprehension ability even, it's because of basic reading skills. They can't decode well enough to read those texts. So basically just highlighting that we need to continue to support reading into secondary school, and if we do, that should have knock-on effects on their vocabulary. And then what the other aspect, this is the last slide now, so the other aspect of what we're doing. So obviously being good at reading is important for vocabulary, and that's something we do kind of know quite a lot about how to intervene. We know how to teach reading quite well. What we don't know is how on earth to get them to read more. So that's really tough. So we're starting a naturalistic experiment, and what we're doing is we're submitting this as a registered report. So we're submitting our design to a journal, and then the reviewers will comment on our design, and then only once we've got the design sorted will we actually run it. So it's a bit of a slow way to do it, but it means that you get the best design possible, and it means it's accepted for publication regardless of what you actually find, which is quite nice in science. So what we're looking at is a SMS diary interventions. This has been done in the context of healthy eating research. So there's evidence and all sorts of health behaviours. So actually what children will set their own goals for how much they want to read, and then they'll have a nice nicely designed web-based diary that they'll then complete, and they'll get feedback on how much they're reading in relation to their goals. And so it's a method for trying to encourage them to read more, using sort of health behaviour research strategy. And then we're going to look at whether the amount that they read predicts their word learning. And so it's a sort of experimental way of getting at what's the effect of the amount that they're reading on their learning over and above how good they are at reading. So that's ongoing work. And that's it.